Have the turbo off of the Conquest or the Starion. I believe they're the same turbocharger. And this one is the one that doesn't have any fins damage on the compressor wheel. And I think this is the one that came off the car because the turbine or the whole shaft, you could hear how wobbly it is. So it most likely was leaking oil into the exhaust, which caused smoke. And that is my hope. So what I need to do is I need to pull this whole thing apart to rebuild it. And usually when I rebuild turbos, now that I've been Cerakoting, I will Cerakote everything just because it helps with temps in the engine bay and it also makes it look better and last longer. So what I'll end up doing is doing the center cartridge in the high temp, the exhaust housing in the high temp, this little weird plate right here in the high temp. It would almost make more sense if this just came off and went into the exhaust, but I'm going to keep it factory exhaust for now. And then I will do the housing or the compressor housing in a, not a high temp, but a 500 degree E-series coating, and it'll just be the aluminum coating. So then the aluminum doesn't get all saturated and crusty with oil over time, because most of the time you can't really clean that. And then I will address everything inside the wastegate actuator. And it really wasn't on there in the first place. The bolts aren't even tight. And that just slides off. There should be a little pin in here. Now, for the turbine housing, most of the time when you're rebuilding a turbocharger, there's really no need to pull this off. But since I'm going to coat everything and most likely put new gaskets everywhere that I possibly can, the feel for it. And if it's starting to feel like it's going to break, you can kind of turn it back in. You can see that one kind of, and it's just very old. Okay, one should still be able to reuse that. So we'll coat all this stuff up. The other thing you want to check on turbochargers when you're rebuilding them is the wastegate actuator. This looks like it has a lot of zinc in this turbine housing. But most of the time, if the turbos, like a lot of the HKS reman housings for like SR20s and some of the GTRs, the RB26s, RB25s, also the Mark III and Mark IV Supras, the upgraded turbos, if they were internally gated, sometimes they would crack from right here across the housing, and then you would have a leak and it wouldn't fully boost. It would make power, but you would always have a weird kind of, it wouldn't be consistent. Sometimes, you know, and that crack would just get worse and worse. And as the temperature increased, it also get worse and worse. So always check that before you're gonna coat a housing or rebuild a turbocharger, because if you have a bad housing, the Volvo S60 V70Rs also does that same thing right there. A kind of V-band clamp that holds the turbine housing on, and it is, I believe it's a 10. We just need to undo that. It looks like the guy put a different, it looks like it's been apart, because this shouldn't spin. It looks like it has a different bolt on that clamp. The good thing is the rebuild kit comes with a new bolt and a new lock nut, so I don't have to save this stuff. And it actually looks like he's probably pulled it off before, because usually they don't look like they're, yeah, this has most likely been apart once or twice, because usually they don't come apart so easily. So as you can see, kind of sort of like a V-band clamp, and then we have a wet exhaust wheel, and you can see, I can try to show how much this moves, so I'll keep this steady. You can see how much play is in that wheel, and what that means is the seal back there, and it probably had a lot of coke in it. So as these older turbos and the really bad, not detergent oil, not synthetic oil that people would use in the 80s and 90s, before the oil really started getting good, these turbochargers would actually coke up That's why you had to let them cool down and kind of let the turbo slow down. If you got into a parking lot and you're kind of ripping on the car, you'd want to let it sit for 30 seconds to a minute, so this kind of equalized the speed, and then it actually cooled if it was a water-cooled turbo. If it was just an oil-cooled turbo, an oil-lubricated turbo, then you would have to let it sit for a little bit longer. But if you didn't do that, the turbos would coke up, or if you had a boost control on it like this one did, they would do the same thing. You can see this has a ton of play in it. I don't know if you can see that on camera, but I mean, it's a lot for a turbocharger. So this shaft might not even be good. So we'll check it out. I do have another shaft. I just don't have a good compressor wheel in the front. The next hardest thing, we'll get this off first, but the next hardest thing is getting this snap ring out, and I will actually pull this fitting down here. These things are such a pain. Or oil drain, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't, oh, you can see some stuff in there. Definitely had some, yeah, you can definitely see some debris in there. Could be from coking, could just be from sitting, but there is definitely debris in there. And the reason you want to get rid of that fitting is so you can get to the holes on the snap ring. So this is the feed. And definitely watch your fingers with these things. What you want right here, it only takes 30 minutes to get there. And if you can get that, you'll be able to get these snap rings to come up, because they are a pain. Definitely a pain. The bane of your existence is snap rings. Like every car guy that's ever rebuilt one of these older turbos, and they're pretty dangerous. So it finally popped out of there, and sometimes they get stuck because just turbos get hot. There's a lot of oil. You can see it's oily, and just heat cycles over time. Most of the time you're not going to bend these unless you pry on them super hard. And you want to go around the outside evenly so you don't mess up the compressor wheel. So the compressor wheel on this one looks pretty decent. The other one had all the fins bent. So this should be a 12 mil on the backside, as you can see right there. And that's how you hold it. Loosening these old ones is actually loosen, so. Okay, so loosen was loosen. This just comes right off usually, like so. Doesn't look like it had much. Usually if there's a worn seal or it's leaking on the compressor side, the whole backside right here will be oily. Doesn't look that bad. And you can see all these shiny sides right here. It doesn't look like there's any oil. That's because it's been rubbing on the housing, because it's been just kind of walking around in there because everything was so loose. This is a journal bearing turbo, so this shaft literally just comes right out like so. There's just a compression ring on the backside. You can actually see that it did have some coke on it. So that's what I'm talking about right there. All of this stuff on this compression ring is called coke. And what it is, it's just old oil that has pretty much cooked to a crisp and turned back into carbon. So now we can see that that was most likely our issue. Doesn't look like there's any issues with the compressor wheel. The shaft looks pretty decent. Usually if these are bad, they'll be super like black or cokey. This whole thing will just be full of that same stuff. We're gonna put compressor wheel kind of back on the shaft, the nut back on there. We have a brand new one of those, so we're not going to reuse it. And then back here, you can see the bearing. Not the best, but really not the worst. And this is kind of a heat shield. You can see all the oil that was leaking past it and coking up. But this, they give you a new one. We may end up reusing it depending. Sometimes the new remanufactured Mitsubishi ones from Mitsubishi don't fit that well. There's another snap ring on this side. And usually what happens, what causes those to play, especially when you have a boost controller, those turbos really weren't meant to be turned up, especially because they're so old. I do have the upgrade kit with the 360-degree washer, but we'll pull this off of here and we should see, we might not have the right snap rings for that. This is a pretty easy snap ring. I just don't have the right snap ring pliers for it. Ooh. Come on. Possibly. Okay. It's almost out. Okay, so most of the time you have to reuse this piece, but as you can see right here, there's a little bit of debris in there from it getting hot, but it still looks pretty decent. This also, the kit comes with a new one of these. This has a little piston ring on it. That's what seals it and keeps the oil. And as you can see, there wasn't much getting by anyway, but we have a new one of those. This is the thrust washer. In turbochargers, most of the time, this is what's causing your issue. If I can get it to come out of here. It really doesn't want to come. But, I mean, I wouldn't say it looks, I guess it's worn in there pretty good. It does have a groove on this side. It does have a groove, so there definitely was enough play in that thrust washer, and it's actually a 360-degree thrust washer already. Usually they're not. Usually they're half thrust washer. And then we have our pieces right here. We have our other journal bearing, which that doesn't look that good. It has a bunch of kind of pitting on it. You can see all this pitting, and maybe the journals were just worn too much on these, both of these bearings. See, this one is pretty black. Maybe it's got starved for oil or something at one point in time. In this turbocharger, it maybe just got some debris in the feed line. But all these steel pieces usually are fine for the thrust washer. Here, there's also a snap ring. You can see right there maybe. And you're going to want to pull that out. You're going to want to pull this roll pin out. Depending on how far you're going to go into this and clean it. It's not the worst shape center section that I've ever seen, but it's also not the best. So it does have some damage. The center section by itself is still a good usable unit. You can see some debris in the cooling water jacket right. Just pulled all of the turbo components out of the ultrasonic cleaner, and you can see how much cleaner everything is. The great thing about the ultrasonic cleaner is it's going to get all of that grime off of everything. Even the turbine housing, as you can see, it really cleaned this thing up. The one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to blast this and Cerakote it. But the one thing I did notice after running the exhaust impeller through the ultrasonic cleaner is it looks like it was actually rubbing on that snap ring. You can see there's a groove right here. So I'm going to pull the other turbocharger apart that had the bent compressor wheel fins, and hopefully that one has the same exhaust impeller, and then I could use that one instead of this one, because this one It doesn't look horrible and it probably would work, but I would rather use one that I know is going to be 100% and not going to have any issues, especially if this thing is kind of worn down, then I'll still have some play. So let's get to blasting everything. The bad thing about using simple green in an ultrasonic cleaner is it pretty much etches the aluminum. So this is more of, it's clean, but you can see right there, that's nice and clean aluminum. And that's kind of etched aluminum because of the solution. The comparison with a factory turbocharger, this is the one with all the bent fins. It looks like he stuck a screwdriver in there trying to get this nut loose to hold the shaft, but you just do it from the backside. So before I go and Cerakote everything, I'm going to micro slick the shaft, which means the bearings are actually going to, the journal bearings are actually going to glide on a really slick surface. So it should actually perform a lot better than a normal journal bearing turbo. As you can see right here, like this is all we get right here. There's no, I mean, this is why journal bearing turbos right here have so much lag. I'm glad I pulled the turbo manifold off the Conquest because it looks like there may have been a previous repair. I'm guessing that's probably not factory right there. But as you can see, it looks like it's cracked again. just finished TIG welding up the exhaust manifold, and this manifold must be really low zinc content because the crack wrapped all the way around it, and as I was welding it, it was, you know, as it cooled down, it was continuing to crack, which, as you can see right here, I was preheating it with that propane torch over there before I went and welded it. And then it continued to crack, and the crack actually started to spider out in a few spots. So I had to kind of chase it around, and so far, this is the last revision of TIG welding it. The weld doesn't look the best because I'm chasing these cracks, but it should do the job. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this flange really quick, and then I'll reblast it, and then I'll probably end up making a log manifold just out of, you know, have a billet flange, have all, it doesn't need to be tubular, but it would be really nice, I think, since every one of these manifolds I saw for sale had a crack on the first runner, and some of them said they didn't have a crack, but who knows how long it would take for it to develop this crack that wraps around. And people have said that this runner actually separates all the way eventually. Now that the turbocharger for the Conquest is fully rebuilt and ready to go, what I need to do, and it also looks better than it would have ever come stock, and it's all Cerakoted. This thing should last for a very long time, and I can't wait to see if it performs better than a factory journal bearing turbo. But what I need to do now before I can even install this on the car, so I ended up having an issue with the exhaust manifold. I tried to weld it multiple times. I preheated it, welded it, and it just ended up cracking more and more. I could never get that crack to pretty much mitigate. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to go downstairs, I'm going to 3D scan this exhaust manifold, so then I can make a flange for the turbo, and then I can make a flange for the head. And then eventually what I'm gonna do is I'll probably make a turbo manifold that just replaces this one, so then I could just have something that is all nice Schedule 10, and I don't have to ever worry about it cracking again. And then if I do design a flange, then later on down the road, if I want to turn it up and put a bigger turbocharger on it with a T3 flange, then I'll be able to make that manifold really easy. So as you can see here, this thing continued to crack, and it just got worse and worse. So I tried, you can see I tried multiple times to get that thing to weld, and it just wasn't having it. So let's get this downstairs. I'll use a 3D scanner, scan everything. Flanges are super easy to design. So I ended up 3D scanning the exhaust manifold, and unfortunately my computer didn't screen record everything that I was doing. So I 3D scanned it, and then I was able to design the flange. So I have the flange that bolts for the exhaust manifold to the head. And then it also made the flange for the turbo to the exhaust manifold, which I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to end up using. I might just use this flange right here, have it made, and then I could just put a T3 turbo on it. I'm going to use some JB Weld or whatever that stuff is that repairs exhaust manifolds, just to test the car out, make sure everything is going to be perfectly fine, see how that turbo performs. You know, it's made to seal up cracks, so it should work perfectly fine. And I looked on a few Conquest forums, and it sounds like that's what people use to actually fix these, because most of the time it seems like you can't weld these because they're so low zinc. So luckily enough, the 3D scanner works perfectly fine, and I was able to get everything scanned, worked out really quick, got this done in maybe 10 minutes. So I'll send this off to Send Send. But if you like these videos, make sure to click the subscribe button, throw a thumbs up, throw a comment below. As always, see you guys next time.